Hello, and thanks very much for joining us for Clause 6, Planning. My name is Jim Moran, and you can reach me at jim@simplifyiso.com. There are three main areas of change in the planning clause. The first thing you'll notice is that there is now a requirement to identify risks. Second thing you'll notice is a new requirement to have an action plan for quality objectives. And finally, you'll see that there's a new requirement for managing change. So, to get started with the details, ISO 9001-2008 had the word risk appear 3 times. In the new standard, you'll see the word risk 49 times. Quite a remarkable change. And often in this standard, when the word risk appears, the word opportunities appears along with it. So you see the phrase risk and opportunities. When you think about it, if you've identified a risk, you've also identified an opportunity to make your system better by anticipating what could go wrong and putting controls in place to prevent unintended results. One way to decide on the risks is to reverse engineer the Ishikawa fishbone diagram. In 1964, when Ishikawa presented the Ishikawa fishbone to the world, he explained that most nonconformances came from 4 major areas. And he identified these 4 areas as man, method, machine, and milieu. So looking at his 4 areas, man, method, machine, and milieu, we can see that in the new standard, man appears in clause 7.1.2, people. And in this area, we want to make sure that we look beyond just the operator to find the cause of the nonconformance, because Ishikawa's research showed that operator error happens, but typically it causes the nonconformance only about 6% of the time. The real cause for the nonconformance lies in either the machine, the method, or the milieu. So Ishikawa's work was very important because it showed that operator errors happen, but typically the operator is the sole cause only about 6% of the time. You'll notice here the word man has the number 7.1.2 under it. That's the clause from ISO 9001-2015. Next area he identified was the method. These would be things like procedures, work instruction, how we actually execute the activity, could apply to virtually anything, service as well as creating products. And in ISO 9001-2015, it's clause 7.1.3, infrastructure, and the milieu is in clause 7.1.4, the work environment. So when we see the word risk and opportunities, or the phrase risk and opportunities, we need to try to identify them. So this is one place you can start. Take a look at your various areas in your organization to see if you can identify some risks associated with either the man, the people, the method, machine, or milieu. Another way to identify risks would be to follow the steps that you've outlined in your process maps. You can see here that if you were to follow the workflow through your organization, it might be fairly easy to discover which ones of these boxes actually have some risks attached to them that we might want to make sure we take care of rather than waiting for something to go wrong. If, for example, some of these boxes had health and safety risks, you could put a little hard hat on the box. If there were an environmental issue you were concerned about, you could put a little tree on the box. And in some cases, we've actually put an R inside a circle and put it in the top left-hand corner of the box so it stands out, sticking outside of the edges of the box. And this alerts anyone doing these activities that there could be a risk either to quality, to themselves, or to the environment. So when you've taken a look at man, method, machine, and milieu for a start, or use your process maps to identify where risks occur, you might be able to simply keep track of them in either a table, database, something like that. A few companies I've worked with have referred to their chart as a risk registry. It's not required by the standard to have a risk registry, and it's not required that you have a formal method for doing this, but it certainly can help. Some of you may come from an industry where they use a formal approach called failure modes, effects, and analysis, lovingly referred to as FMEA. It's a great way to discover risks. It's formal, and it's certainly helpful in a larger organization where simply using the Ishikawa fishbone or the process maps may not bring you enough information to manage risks properly. So the question is, now that you have these risks identified, how do we prioritize them? You might end up with 20 or 30 risks or 200 or 300 risks. So the simplest way to begin the process of prioritizing risks is with a simple consequence versus likelihood model. This is the most basic approach to prioritizing risks. So you can see here in this diagram, the low is at the bottom, high is at the top, and then going across with the consequence, low is at the left, and high consequence is at the right. So obviously the place we need to start when we're prioritizing is in the top right hand corner. In this version, you'll see a slightly more elaborate portrayal or slightly more elaborate depiction, and you can see that this organization has added more than just 2 grades. They've gone to 5 grades, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a little hard to see here, but on the right hand side, top right hand side, are the risks that are unacceptable, and the bottom left hand corner are the risks that are acceptable. Try to keep in mind that the better processes that you have in place, or the more controls that you have in place on potential risks, will lead to less likelihood that the risk will actually manifest itself. So if you have fewer controls and highly dangerous things, make sure that you prioritize the risks in a way that will give you the best bang for your buck. The second area we talked about in Clause 6 is objectives. First of all, you are, as always, required to have quality objectives. And one good thing to keep in mind when you're determining or creating your objectives is the word SMART. And it stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time limited. This will give you a very clear picture of where you're headed and make it easy for people to understand when you've arrived. It'll also make it easier for you to understand how well you're moving towards the target or if you're making any progress. The next thing you need to take care of in this section is an action plan to hit the target. You might remember Einstein's definition of insanity, which was doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. So in order to avoid this, the standard requires in clause 6.2.2 that you create an action plan. And the action plan needs to include what it is that you're going to do. It needs to identify what resources you need to do this. It also wants you to appoint someone who's going to be in charge. It wants to have an end date in mind or a specific time when it should be finished. And finally, you need to know ahead of time how you're going to evaluate the results. This will give you clear evidence of what direction you're headed, whether you're making any progress, and all your employees will be able to see what kind of contribution they're making towards reaching the goal. Finally, in this section, you'll see a requirement to manage change. It's quite an interesting requirement, and it is new. This is not something that we have seen before, although most organizations have been pretty good at managing changes related to documentation. This requirement involves more than just simply the documentation. I can give you an example. If a customer were to change their order, and this is often where changes begin, this could cause a change in design. If the design changed enough, purchasing might have to acquire new inputs to continue with the project. If this were the case, the inputs might be changed enough that you'd have to change how you use the new material. In fact, you'd have to change your process. If the process changes, you may end up changing the way you measure the effectiveness of the process. And finally, because of the changes, you might actually have to change the way you package the outputs or the results of the series of events. So if you're delivering a service differently, if a client asks for a different outcome from some consulting you're doing, it still would probably change the contract, but not necessarily a design or purchasing. So there you have it. First of all, there's a whole new focus on risk that we hadn't seen before. Secondly, quality objectives need an action plan to explain how you're going to meet the objective. Finally, changes need to be managed. You can always rest assured that if a change happens, risk will go up. So feel free to pop over to our website. You'll see a tab here for some ISO tips. You'll see another tab here for some training support. And by all means, feel free to contact me, Jim, at simplifyiso.com. And I'll be looking forward to seeing you in the next video, Clause 7 Support. Bye for now.